That's not what I said, but yes, he did.
We'll get started in just a couple of minutes. We're triple checking the technology side of things, making sure everything is in order.
He's looking at it now.
No, where your head right now. I didn't see it.
All right, it's good.
Is it not? Is the sound
It's
on?
going.
I've got sound. Haven't heard from the phone mic.
We don't have it on yet.
I didn't remember the lights being here this morning.
I don't know if we can turn the lights
Well,
down.
no, if they're.
Oh, yeah, that is where they are. Nothing we can do about
I didn't
that.
remember that this morning.
Okay, so we're good?
Yeah.
All right.
I've got a clear picture. I could hear the ambient sound.
All right, we are ready when the main attractions are ready.
You ready? Sure. Sure. All right. You ready?
Yeah.
Okay. Good evening and welcome to Dickinson State University, the Theodore Roosevelt Center, and by help of the History Honor Society. I'm very pleased tonight to welcome Dr. Nichola Gutgold for the return of our visiting lecturer series. A brief pandemic break took this away from life happening. For those of you who are already here, who know this, the History Honor Society is re-emerging under the guidance of Dr. Jeff Wells. Also here sitting in the audience is the president of the university, Dr. Steve Easton. Thought I would acknowledge them. My role tonight is to do a couple of different things. First, to welcome you all here and there, and to thank a number of people, and then to introduce Sarah Griffiths, who will introduce our speaker. So in terms of thanks, there are a number of folks who I should do. First, beyond this, is the staff of the Theodore Roosevelt Center, some of whom you may see roam through the camera. This is Dr. William Hansard. Eric Johnson is out in the hallway. Kelly Highland, Jenna Kuntz, Dwayne Junt, and Valerie Naylor, all probably watching from a distance and scattered around the country at the moment. So those are all very good things. Just want to say thank them. I just wanted to thank them for all the work they've done to make this happen. The second part of this is to thank the folks in the honors program for showing up over and over and over again for the Theodore Roosevelt Center. We'll put you to work again this fall. There's a symposium coming. This fall's theme is freedom struggles. If you're interested in it, come talk to me. Happy to talk about it. For those of you out there, you'll hear about it later. It's coming your way soon. So my next task is to introduce Sarah Griffiths, and I'm very pleased to do so. Sarah's a senior, majoring in English, minoring in almost everything else. History, coaching, leadership, and probably more. I'll stop there. She's a member of the Theodore Roosevelt Honors Leadership Program. She is the new president of the newly restated History Society and League of Political Scientists. Louder, louder, says the man in the back. I've never had to be louder in my life, but I can do it. The other thing that Sarah does is she's doing an internship at the Theodore Roosevelt Center. And I would like to thank her for doing that. And I would like to tell you that we have put her through her paces. Every little bit of the job that we do, we've kind of thrown at her and said, okay, do this week. So other than she's done helps out the library, helps out an archive, done social media outreach. She's begun rewriting our Wikipedia page, which is now more than 10 years old. Let's see, we did what's officially called archival hazing by handing her a box of stuff and saying, sort this all out. Anybody who's in the game knows that that's how you actually start. The only thing that she's not been willing to do, nor has any of my staff, is sit with me and stare at budget spreadsheets. So that's probably a sign that she's a very smart person. That's good taste on her part. So without further ado, Sarah Griffiths.
Yes. Okay. As Dr. O'Brien said, we are very excited to have our visiting scholar here. She's a professor of communication arts and sciences at Penn State, and author of numerous books that highlight women's firsts in male-dominated fields. She has traveled the world, sharing her passion for identifying these women, and has appeared in outlets such as NPR, the New York Times, the Washington Post, has even given a TEDx PSU talk in 2013. She's here with us this evening to present her knowledge on the role of First Lady in the United States, First Lady First, and other facts focusing on Edith, Kermit, Carow, Roosevelt, and Dr. Jill Biden. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Nichola.
I really appreciate your wonderful introduction. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here at the Theodore Roosevelt Center. It's a tremendous honor. Students, thank you so much for coming tonight. Like they say on the airlines, we know you have many choices about how you spend your Wednesday evening, Thursday evening, but you're here and I appreciate it. I want to really thank deeply the Theodore Roosevelt Center, especially your director, Dr. Chris O'Brien, for his gracious invitation, Dr. William Hansard, Eric Johnson, Kelly Highland, and Sarah Griffiths, who I'm looking forward to following your trajectory because it's students like you who truly, truly pave the way and are trailblazers. So thank you for being so ambitious and for the work you're doing here, because I can't wait to find out what you'll be doing next. I'll be writing a book about you next, Sarah. So great. Thank you so much for having me. So a question I have for all of you tonight is, if you could be First Lady, would you be First Lady? And so let's think about that for a minute as my slide doesn't.
Oh, down button, is it not?
Yes, I'm trying. William, I need
I'm
you.
so sorry.
That's okay, it happens. So think about that. And those of you in higher ed, the spousal hire, would you go along with your spouse and do the thing your spouse is doing as second string? Because in fact, many first ladies in some ways have had that kind of an experience as a first lady. So think about what a title is. Think about just that title itself, First Lady. Is it still a relevant title? And if it were a man, would you like men in the room tonight to be called the first gentleman? Would you think, current, fine, call me that, sounds good. Let's not answer that yet. Let's keep that on our minds as we go through this presentation tonight. Thank you, William. So, Dolly Madison, legend has it, she was our first lady to be referred to as the First Lady. But there are some facts about being First Lady that may not be totally cool with a lot of people finding themselves in that position. For example, Michelle Obama did not clearly think that there was equal pay in the White House because her job as First Lady, like all First Lady jobs, came with no salary. How many here would like to work for no salary? Not me. And no official duties. Most people like to know what they're supposed to be doing in the job. It's one of the first things job applicants ask. Could you tell me more about the job duties, so to speak? And guess what? The job is not even in the Constitution. So we're going to quickly take a little, walk down memory lane to give us some perspective on how the women in this role proceeded in the role. So there she is. She's Martha Washington. I know you heard of her. She was the wife of the Continental Army's commander-in-chief, and she organized fundraising campaigns that called upon women to donate money. She also is the first lady to appear on currency. And Martha Jefferson, as you're going to see tonight in the next couple minutes or so, 10 minutes or so, some of these women didn't get to fulfill the role of First Lady because, well, they died. And that was the case for Martha Jefferson. She died 18 years before Thomas Jefferson was elected president. And Abigail Smith Adams, strong advocate for women's rights. You might have heard her phrase. She urged her husband, John, to remember the ladies, John. And that's how we think of her. She loved to write letters, which provide a summary of 18th century life. and they do reveal her roles as a wife, a parent, and a friend. And when we think about the role of first ladies, we think about, well, something that First Lady scholar Elizabeth Jody Natali has said. She said, quote, First ladies created roles for themselves and responded to the need for behavior that supports a presidential administration beyond the role of supportive wife. So keep that in mind too. What are these roles that go beyond the role of supportive wife? Another important scholar of first ladies, Robert Watson, has said that we can look for 12 sub-roles of first ladies. And these are also some sub-roles that I want you to think about tonight when we talk about these wonderful women. And by the way, I do admire every one of them. Dolly Madison, for example, she worked with the architect Benjamin Henry Latrobe to furnish the White House. We don't think about those kinds of things, do we? That, oh, we're going to be first lady and let's see how the place looks, right? But she had to, help define the role of first lady. She started to think about maybe working with local charities or taking up social issues would be a way to proceed. But as I was saying, Robert Watson said, yes, wife and mother, very important role for a first lady. How about public figure and celebrity? Oh yeah, we see them, and more than ever, because we live in the age where if you are a visible person, if you are a powerful person, you are going to be a celebrity and you're going to be on TMZ and all the cool sites. You're going to be a social hostess. So we recently had the egg roll. Our current first lady is big on education, so she called it the education role. Work with me here, people. She's also a symbol of American woman. And so if she doesn't act the way we think an American woman should act, she gets a lot of criticism for it. So you could imagine some of the ways that maybe the public says, not the way I would do it, not being a lady. I'll give you an example. I used to live in a rural town, a country town in Pennsylvania. And about 20 years ago, I was driving my car and I saw a little wooden sign nailed to a tree that said, Teresa Heinz Carey is not first lady material. So just to give you a little idea, someone was thinking that the wife of John Kerry, who was at the time running for president 20-ish years ago, didn't think that she had the chops to be the first lady. So I think they were commenting on her symbolism as an American woman. She's a White House manager and a preservationist. She's a campaigner. Almost all first ladies try to assist their husbands in their political goals, and sometimes they prove to be even better at it than the person running for president. They're also a social advocate, as we will find out a little more in this talk tonight. They're a champion of social causes. They are a presidential spokesperson. Sometimes the best person to send out on the campaign trail is the person who is perhaps more endearing to the American people. Sometimes that has been the first lady. Just ask John Kennedy when he went to France how much his wife was adored. She's a political party booster. She's a diplomat. She's a policy expert sometimes. She's a lobbyist, maybe behind the scenes, and we'll talk a little bit about that. And she's also a presidential counselor and confidant, oftentimes. It's the first lady who really has the president's ear, who can really convince him about a way to proceed with the country. So Elizabeth Monroe, she neglected many of her duties. That caused criticism, but the poor woman had epilepsy. So she was too ill to leave the White House, and Louisa Johnson Adams. She was a very creative first lady. She wrote a memoir, which was very remarkable for the time. Rachel Jackson, she died from a heart attack 3 months before her husband's inauguration. So Anise, pictured here, Emily, did many of the duties of first ladies, and the first lady would have done. And that is the case often in olden times. Oh, and she was also criticized by the press, and that was the first time that happened. Hannah Van Buren died of tuberculosis complicated by childbirth a full 18 years before her husband took office. And so the daughter-in-law, Angelica, stepped in. Hannah would have been the first lady to have been born a true US citizen. Anna Harrison, 1871, the age of 65. She was the oldest woman. That's not true. Jill Biden, Dr. Jill Biden is the oldest. We'll talk about that a little bit to say that longevity is much more common now. You know, to be 70 years old is not old, and don't say it is. Letitia Christian Tyler, First Lady from 41 to 42, not very long. She suffered a stroke. She attended only one public function. These are kind of depressing back then. You know, you see they had very limited roles. Now, Sarah Polk, she set a very dignified tone as First Lady. She had 4 years in the role, but she banned dancing, she banned card playing, she banned serving of most alcoholic beverages, and she wasn't the only one, as we'll find out tonight. There was another First Lady who also wasn't big on alcoholic beverages, but she did host that very first Thanksgiving dinner in the White House, which has become an important tradition. Margaret Smith Taylor died from gastroenteritis after only 16 months. Her husband died. Margaret stayed in her bedroom while his funeral was held, as First Lady Peggy refused to host social events. Instead, she was a very shy woman. Her daughter Betty stepped in on her behalf. She was the First Lady to shoot a gun. How about that? Abigail Fillmore. She had a persistent foot injury, so First Lady duties were often turned to her daughter, Mary. She loved books, and she made a very important contribution, and that was the very first and magnificent White House library. She secured funds from Congress. She was Millard Fillmore's teacher, and that's how they met. Jane Appleton Pierce experienced a terrible tragedy, the death of their sole surviving son in a train accident. So she spent most of her time as First Lady alone in her rooms. She asked friends and family to play the role of White House hostess. She simply wasn't up to it. Sadly, the only First Lady to lose all 3 of her children before living in the White House. Harriet Lane. As the only bachelor president, James Buchanan asked his niece, for whom he was the legal guardian, to take on the duties of First Lady. She became known as the Democratic Queen of the White House, and she was a popular hostess. So there was a presidential yacht named for her. So that's unusual. And we've all heard of Mary Todd Lincoln, a little bit about her life. Although she was born on a slaveholding plantation, Mary was a fervent and tireless supporter of the Union. Yet, some people did accuse her of being a Confederate spy. She sadly was next to her husband, holding his hand when he was shot by an assassin. Eliza Johnson, First Lady, wife of Andrew, slowed by the tuberculosis that would eventually claim her life. She passed on most of her duties to her oldest daughter. And she was known as a very, very important advisor to her husband, as we will see later. Some later First Ladies are credited in this way. And she taught her husband how to spell and do math. Julia Grant. Before she became First Lady, she often joined her husband at his military postings. She went to the front lines during the Civil War. She didn't like any pictures of her straight on because of her crossed eyes. And she wrote her memoirs. Lemonade Lucy was the nickname that Lucy Hayes got because she said no drinking at the White House. However, despite that, hard to believe, no, just kidding. She was a popular First Lady. She supported a variety of causes, including adequate funding for mental health care and education, way ahead of her time there. And she set a standard for political activity among future First Ladies. She graduated from college, very first Lady to do so. Lucretia Garfield, she took an interest in the history of the White House began lobbying Congress for funds to make much-needed internal repairs. And it wasn't unusual for first ladies to be surprised by the conditions of the White House. It may have looked somewhat grand from the exterior, but many of them found it to be not good enough, as Edith Roosevelt did, and said we need a much bigger White House. So we'll learn a little bit more about that. Ellen Arthur, she never served as First Lady because sadly she died. So in her absence, the president's sister stepped in as the White House hostess. And we get this idea that I think it's interesting, someone has to do it. Someone is needed to do all of the, hostessing. So, even when a first lady died or just couldn't do it for whatever reason, there was someone to help. She actually met her future husband when he was 27 and she was a newborn. Scandalous, right? She took over the duties of being White House hostess from Cleveland's sister Rose after she married the president. And she was a very social woman, holding 2 receptions a week, and tried to be sensitive to working women. She used her painting skills to design a new formal presidential china that depicted the United States coat of arms, bordered by corn and goldenrod to symbolize the nation's abundance. She's championed women's rights. She was the first lady to put a Christmas tree in the White House, which, if you go on YouTube and you want to Google, or you want to put in there, presidential Christmas decorations, amazing. Ida Saxton McKinley, First Lady from 1897 to 1901, wife of William. Onset of epilepsy when she was in her 30s limited her, but she remained a trusted advisor. And here we go. Whoops, how could I do it? How could I pass her up? Terrible. There she is, Edith Carow Roosevelt, First Lady from 1901 to 1909, the wife of Theodore T.R. Teddy Roosevelt. And of course, one of the big contributions she made was she entered the White House with a large brood and said, this is just not enough room for us. In fact, the children, as you might have read, were playing all over the house. There is a photo of Archie on a horse in front of the White House, which pushed the decision a little bit to say, I think we need more space, so the kids could play. And so that we can hold a state dining is, larger people, a group of people for dinner. And so that we weren't working, quote, as Edith put it, above the store, living above the store. Edith honored her predecessors by hanging portraits of former first ladies along a ground floor corridor of the White House. And also especially notable, first lady to see the need for a full-time social secretary. Now that position has been a very important one. Many social secretaries of first ladies go on to write memoirs of their own from their time as first lady, as social secretary to the first lady. Some of them consider her the ladies' lady, first lady's lady, very important role, because it was recognized by Edith, this job is just too big. I'm becoming a public figure. People are requesting interviews of me. I need to manage photographs of the children. I don't want them always in the papers. Newspapers and magazines were really becoming very popular. And of course, Alice was a huge sensation. And the press wanted more. And Edith said, we've got to figure this out. We will return to Edith Carow Roosevelt a little bit later tonight. Helen Taft followed Edith, and she was responsible for introducing the famous cherry blossom trees. And we think sometimes of these contributions as minor, and they're anything but. I mean, these are traditions that are very important to our nation, even to this day. But she suffered a stroke, but she still oversaw the construction of the bandstand, West Potomac Park, and she was the first lady to accompany her husband in the inaugural parade. And we think about what a time-honored tradition that is for our country. It's so important that we have that parade. Ellen Wilson, First Lady from 1913 to 1914, wife of Woodrow. She died from kidney disease after only 17 months, but she was really intent on improving housing conditions for African Americans in DC. And then Edith Wilson became the first lady during World War I. She observed gasless Sundays, meatless Mondays, and wheatless Wednesdays to try to set an example for rationing efforts. Florence Harding, she avidly supported the care of wounded World War I veterans, and we'll see our current First Lady has a strong interest in military families. She was informally accused of poisoning her husband since she refused to allow an autopsy. And when we think about some of the ways that our First Ladies have received bad press, that's certainly one of them. Former teacher, Grace Coolidge, she worked for education and child welfare issues, certainly something in common with Dr. Biden. She was stylish, sporty. She eagerly participated in photo ops with her pets. She was popular. Lou Hoover, First Lady from 1929 to 33, wife of Herbert. She became one of the first women in America to earn a degree in geology. She also spoke fluent Chinese. She founded the National Women's Conference on Law Enforcement. She delivered her own radio broadcast, very first lady to do so. And of course, Eleanor Roosevelt, very famous First Lady. The niece of President Theodore Roosevelt, Eleanor married Franklin, her fifth cousin once removed. So she never had to change her last name, very convenient. Sworn in as president, Eleanor began to transform the conventional royal First Lady from social hostess to that of a much more visible, active participant, traveled, held regular press conferences, wrote a daily newspaper article, submitted a monthly column to a variety of magazines, truly a transformational First Lady in many ways. Elizabeth Bess Wallace Truman, most significant contribution was overseeing structural renovations of the White House. She was very private. She never gave an interview. That was her choice. Mary Eisenhower, Mamie, led fundraising drives for the American Heart Association. And she invited African American children to the White House's Easter egg roll. Of course, Jackie Kennedy, one of the most iconic First Ladies, the man who accompanied Jackie Kennedy to Paris. Her beauty was admired, she was stylish, young. Her children, like Edith Roosevelt, were admired, the young family in the White House, sadly. We see the photos of her all the time from that horrible day in Dallas when her husband was shot and killed. Her husband was the first Roman Catholic president. Claudia Johnson, known as Lady Bird. Family nurse declared her she was pretty as a ladybird, and the name stuck. Of course, she's very instrumental for the beautification of the country. Now we're getting into the modern times. Pat Nixon, she was deeply wounded by the scandal that drove her husband from office. She was heavily criticized for her demeanor, her reserved demeanor, sometimes called Plastic Pat, which was a First Lady who wore pantsuits and ushered in that era for women. Betty Ford was a very important First Lady. She was diagnosed with breast cancer after her husband took office. She also gave an interview with 60 Minutes and said that if she had the opportunity to try pot, she would, to just, discover the effects or, find out what the effects would be. Scandalous at the time. It was the 1970s. She overcame her own dependence on alcohol and prescription pills. She founded the Betty Ford Center. But she was named Time Magazine's Woman of the Year, mostly because of her candidness, her ability to just come out and say what she was thinking, and that would help people. So Rosalind Smith Carter, she worked for the mentally ill. She traveled extensively with her husband. She was also a strong advisor to her husband, and she was the First Lady to keep her own office in the East Wing. Nancy Reagan, she also worked for the mentally ill, also a campaign, Just Say No to Drugs for young people. She was heavily criticized for spending lavishly on her clothing in China, but she was named the Los Angeles Times Woman of the Year, California woman. Barbara Bush. She loved literacy. She was the first lady to publish a book about her dog, the first dog, Millie. It's a book from the dog's perspective, dog living in the White House. And she's the second first lady to be the wife of one president and the mother of another, Hillary Clinton. A trailblazing first lady who ran for Senate, the only woman in the United States to be nominated by a major party for the presidency. And received a lot of criticism for having responsibilities that went beyond the sphere of what Americans felt like a first lady should do. Laura Bush created the National Book Festival. She also, a former librarian, is a book lover. Her daughter now, Jenna Bush, is very famous for her own book club that she has and her love of books and she uses social media to help that gain a lot of attention. Michelle Obama, she described herself as a mom in chief when she became first lady. She also joined hands with Dr. Biden, who at the time was the second lady, to support military families, called Joining Forces. It's still in existence today with the direction of our first lady. And she also took on childhood obesity. She was the first African-American first lady. Melania Trump was an international fashion model before marrying Donald Trump. And she created a luncheon for International Women's Day as part of her first lady duties. She spoke about being a female immigrant. And she is, English is not her first language. She's the first lady. Jill Biden was second lady when Joe Biden became vice president to President Barack Obama. And she commuted from the White House to Northern Virginia Community College. She continues to do that as first lady. And she is the first lady to work outside of the White House in a paid position. She has kept her job as a community college professor. So let's think a little bit about some of the similarities that I found when I was researching Jill Biden and Edith Kermit Carow Roosevelt. They were both the second wife of their widowed future president husband. Joe Biden was married previously. Sadly, his wife was killed in a car accident, as well as his young daughter. They were both second lady before they became first lady. And they both entered the White House during times of national tragedy. President McKinley succumbed to an assassin's bullet, which brought the Roosevelts to the White House. And the United States was experiencing a national pandemic when the Bidens took office. There are similarities to the bustling family atmosphere of both the Roosevelts' tenure in the White House as well as the Bidens. So the Bidens' children are grown up, but they have 7 grandchildren. And anyone who makes comments about life in the White House with the Bidens say that it's a family White House and that the 7 Biden grandchildren are frequently found in the White House. And there's Roosevelt with his children, and there's the Bidens with their grandchildren. Edith Roosevelt, her tenure resulted in the creation of an official staff, and her formal dinners and ceremonial processions served to elevate the position of First Lady. Both were hostesses to White House weddings. Edith Roosevelt helped to host Alice's wedding to Nicholas, and Dr. Jill Biden helped coordinate the wedding of her granddaughter, Naomi Biden, to Peter Neal. And the wedding ceremony took place not that long ago in front of 250 guests on the South Lawn. So there were 2 White House weddings. Another similarity is that they craved family privacy and memory making. Edith Roosevelt sought out this home, Pine Knot in Keene, Virginia, a place where the family could go and rest and relax. And there's the Biden Beach House in Delaware that they adore and love to go to for their own R&R. And even though they have other ways that there are other places they could go, I saw that as a real similarity, that they crave the family privacy and they wanted to make memories. TR had a lot of support for mothers. He said marriage must be an equal partnership with true affection, partnership. And Edith, though she didn't work outside of the home, she did the finances, she had her own charities, and she felt very duty bound. For Biden, Joe Biden has said that career is less important than the marriages. The marriage is the most important thing, and that was part of his Biden heritage. He learned it from his family, and she learned it from hers as well. Her parents had a very beautiful, romantic marriage, and she has written in her biography, Dr. Biden has written that that was something she really, really wanted, a very strong marriage and a very committed partnership with her husband. So let's talk a little bit about Dr. Jill Biden. She has a support for military families, and I've been working on a biography of her. So the first, she's not a natural public speaker. You might see her, she's an extremely active first lady. As second lady, she traveled to over 40 countries, and already as first lady, she's been to more than 10 countries, more than 40 states, and she is extremely active giving speeches. If you go to the White House website, all the speeches are together, so you have to look for the ones of Dr. Biden's. But think about this. The very first time she stood at a podium and gave a speech on behalf of her husband, Joe Biden, who was a presidential candidate in 1987, her hands were shaking. Her timid, tentative voice came out no louder than a whisper as she read word from the papers in front of her. And she wrote in her autobiography, "I got through that speech by sheer will because I had to." But in the years that follow, she came to realize that people wanted to hear from her. Again, the role of the First Lady is a big role in American life. And she's popular. So she is the wife of an increasingly more public man. And now, she's perhaps the most public wife in the United States. She's the First Lady. So her words are a surrogate for her husband's political campaigns and for several causes that she really believes in. Support for military families. Her father was a Navy signalman, and her late son, Beau, she and President Biden's late son, Beau, also served in the military. And she started her involvement in Delaware's Boots on the Ground before she became First Lady. And she really cares about military initiatives. So she gives a lot of speeches about that and travels around for that. Cancer moonshot is very, very important to her. So she is very interested in, and so is President Biden, in furthering cancer research. Sadly, their son Beau died of cancer, and many of their friends and family have also suffered with it recently. Dr. Biden had skin cancer, and so it's a very important initiative. She's also a very passionate advocate for education. One of her quotes is that education is possibility set in motion. And she said, "My students have shown me so many times that it's not always about being the perfect person in the perfect position. It's about showing up when you need it." And some characteristics of her rhetoric. Her rhetoric stems from her own lived experiences. She often uses her own examples from her own life to back up her claims. They underscore her own belief system. And she often says, we need women to better reflect the social fabric of our society. So she came to her position as First Lady with a variety of roles that inform her ethos. The White House website describes her as First Lady Jill Biden, community college educator, military mother and grandmother, and wife of President Joseph R. Biden. She was probably not surprised to find herself in the role of First Lady, and she has often said that she would not squander the role if she had the chance to become First Lady. So, questions for thought. How has the role of First Lady changed from Martha Washington to Dr. Jill Biden? If a woman were to become president, what might her husband be called? What do you think? Is the role and/or the title of First Lady outdated? So being First Lady is a lot, and each woman has a debt of gratitude to the women who have come before her. The role has certainly changed with the times, but is it time for more changes to the role? Thank you very much. Follow me on Instagram. Every Monday morning, I give you a speech tip. So, questions. Anybody with a question about whether or not you think we should rebrand the role and the title, First Lady? What do you think? Is it great to have the tradition? Yes.
Yeah, what would you think would be fair for a new name for the first lady or first gentleman?
Well, I was thinking maybe more like the president's partner, maybe something like that, where it's not gender specific. What do you think? Other ideas? Another question I have is, do you think that all people who find themselves in this role need to fulfill it? What if someone gets elected president and his or her spouse says, you know, I love what you're doing, but I'm, you know, really busy with what I'm doing, which might be their own profession. I recently researched the first gentlemen of women who are governors. And I discovered that many of them keep their profession. Some of them are dentists, some of them are business people. And I wondered if that would be the case if there were more, you know, if we took that to the national level, if we said, well, you know, for example, when Dean was running for president, Howard Dean was running for president in Vermont, his wife, a medical doctor, did not campaign with him very often, if at all. I want to say she was almost never with him. And she said, well, I'm busy, I'm a doctor. I'm doing my job, my profession, I'm fulfilling my destiny. Do you think that's a cool response? Anybody? Do you think that would be okay? Or do you think there's a duty if your partner is elected President of the United States? You better drop what you're doing and do that partner role. What do you think?
Well, I think given the position isn't even a paid position, I think it's completely fair for you to continue with your career. But it's just,
I'll jump in.
Yeah.
So the security that surrounds the First Lady has clearly grown over the time that you talked about.
Yeah.
Dr. Jill Biden does not appear anywhere without a significant amount of Secret Service.
Yes.
And so even teaching at a community college involves they had to restructure part of the community college so she could continue her teaching career. It seems like given the role and the constraints on it, we might be stuck. It'd be difficult to continue to be a doctor or to be a teacher or even to be a community college professor.
That's a good point. Well, I know that that people around Dr. Biden said you can't do it. You cannot continue. On the one hand, it's great that she does it. On the other hand, it makes us look like we don't work that hard. You can be, no, I'm just kidding. But I guess what I'm saying is, I think they have Secret Service who pose as students and they make sure she's very, very safe. I would imagine that would be possible for other professions. They could have them pose as drug sale reps, patients, you know. But I'm being a little silly, but I think they probably could get that person to be safe, even if she's working in another industry or profession. But I think that person would get a lot of criticism for not being there for the important ceremonial events that we expect the spouse to be there for. There would be, who would host the YouTube video about the Christmas decorations? And clothing gets a lot of attention, for better or for worse. I had the privilege of being at the Smithsonian in January to see Dr. Biden present her inaugural outfits to the Smithsonian exhibit that's so famous on First Lady clothing. And she said she would like to see some gentlemen's clothing at this exhibit soon. And I think that would be good too. Yes.
On that note, when we come to expect all of these things from these first ladies, what do you think the discussion is going to be in public when we have a first gentleman? Are we going to expect anything from him?
It's a
Or are we
good
going
question.
to expect him to do that YouTube video for Christmas?
Great question. Well, we have a partial prototype because we have a second gentleman, Mr. Doug Emhoff, and he said he wants to be a good role model, and he does represent the administration across the country. And so I'm not sure what the ceremonial duties are for second spouses in terms of, you know, I know they're not as ramped up as when you're the first partner. So I guess we'll have to find out. We'll have to see if, you know, what that looks like when there is the first, the president's partner who is not a woman. We'll have to see if it changes at all. And if there's still great interest in his inaugural tux, for example, will be revealed at the last minute, you know, the color, the designer, you know, because it's quite the spectacle. You know, we're very interested in clothing, which is not necessarily a bad thing. It's part of the pageantry. But I do think there's a lot of pressure on first ladies to look the part, to fulfill that part of it. And it's astonishing to me sometimes when I'll say to someone, I write about first ladies or I write about women in politics. And sometimes the very first response I get from very smart people is, oh, I can't stand her hair, or I don't like her clothing. I don't know why she wears those dresses. You know, so it's just part and parcel of the position. Any other questions about, yes, sir.
So in countries that have some rough similarities to ours, New Zealand, Canada, what of those countries are there any of them that have very different traditions about spouses of prime ministers?
That's a great question. Some are quite similar. There's some expectation of appearance from the wife of the prime minister, for example. But one of the reasons I became interested in the rebranding idea of the first lady is in Chile, the first lady said, I'm not doing it. I'm not doing it. And so I started to research that, and apparently it's still her desire not to fulfill the traditional role. So I think that, you know, we can look at countries like that, or we can look at countries that have women presidents and ask, what does the male spouse do? Is he doing similar things? You know, that would be a great way to benchmark and to look at what other countries are doing. Great question. Thank you. Anyone else with any questions for tonight? Well, you've been a fantastic audience.
Well, I've got more questions.
Oh, good. I would love another.
So I got two questions. The second one will be obvious probably after the first question. First question is, in her time as First Lady, who was the most popular? I mean, I've got two candidates in mind, and I'm wondering if it is one of those two.
You know, I don't know that I can answer it perfectly because I don't know all of the first ladies so intimately, but Jackie Kennedy comes to mind as a first lady who truly caught the nation's imagination for a few good reasons. She was young, beautiful, had a young family, and she also was very creative in the way she used the media. She gave a tour of the White House that had a huge viewership when it aired on television. And I know my mother was fascinated with the Kennedys. And to this day, I still have the newspapers of when President Kennedy was assassinated that my mother had kept from back then. So I think she really does spring to mind as someone that, you know, is probably very close to being one of the most popular.
A lot of staying power too. 2 decades after she was First Lady, she
You know, I was talking about this with a friend of mine who's also a First Lady scholar, and she told me that she has clothing that was like, you know, advertised as like Jackie lookalike clothing, you know, that, and you can buy jewelry that is similar. You know, it's to this day, it's not unusual to pass a newspaper, you know, a tabloid paper that's still talking about her, you know, so many years after her death. So she springs to mind as the most popular in my mind. I don't know who would be a runner-up, you know, but
Well, I was thinking Eleanor Roosevelt, but I don't know if that's a legitimate, very different form of popularity or notoriety.
like impactful,
Mhm.
a very impactful woman and someone we wouldn't forget, for sure.
So my second of the two-parter is, who was the most controversial or the most disliked in her time as First Lady?
I think controversial, Hillary Clinton. I think that she was breaking barriers, first heading up the healthcare and running for Senate while she was still First Lady. And I think that, you know, one researcher said that she was like a Rorschach test of, you know, what we could take as a woman in power. And I think she still is considered the most controversial First Lady. You were either one way or the other. There were very few people that were mild about her. They either loved her or they really disdained her. So I think she was the most controversial in my mind.
I got two questions to sort of build upon the theme of popularity of First Ladies. What strikes me is it seems there are times in certain administrations where the president is popular, yet the First Lady is not, or vice versa, where the First Lady has a popularity more than the president. I think it's safe to say that Laura Bush is an example of that. I think it's safe to say Jill Biden might be an example of that. Are there any other examples, or are there any dynamics you've noticed where there's been any sort of tension or sort of a different dynamic when the First Lady is more popular than the president?
Well, I don't know if, like, behind closed doors, you know, they're not very pleased, you know, that maybe the First Lady. I think another example would be Betty Ford. I think she was just more famous, even after, you know, posthumously. I think we think of her more often as someone who impacted American life in a way that we don't think about Gerald Ford. So I think, I wonder about the tension. It reminds me of the royal family, you know, the tension if one royal is more popular. Sometimes I think there's a esprit de corps in the White House, that it's the administration. I'd like to think that it's not a house divided, that if the First Lady is more popular than the president, it's not causing a marital rift or even the staff to be upset. You would think that it would be good that somebody's popular, you know, that, you know, send out the First Lady. At least it'll be a face of the administration that can help us if we're not doing well in the polls and we're worried. Usually that's a great weapon for the White House. And I do think Dr. Biden is very popular. It's hard to argue with what she's asking for, you know, investing in cancer research, helping our military families, and she's a proponent of education. You know, those are things that most people can agree are good things. So she is very popular. That's very true.
So second part of my question on popularity is, do you see a tie between the popularity of a First Lady and notions that she is more feminine? And conversely, it anecdotally seems to me that when a First Lady is unpopular or is seen as maybe overstepping the role, then her femininity is called into question.
100%. I think we have still in our country a very narrow sphere of what a woman should be within a family, unfortunately. And I think that we look at the first family as an archetype of perfection. Whether it comes close or not, I don't think any family is perfect, but we will criticize a woman who seems to have too much power, or the trope that she's bossing her husband. And I always go right to the comments. So if there's ever an interview with the first family, I like to go right to the comments, because that gets right to it, right? If she is appropriately feminine or supporting him, being positive about it, usually comes out in the comments. If she's not, we'll see that too. Unfortunately.
I have a question that's coming from online.
Oh, great.
From our staff member, Kelly Highland, who could not be here but is attending remotely. And she asks, you mentioned both the Roosevelts and the Bidens really valued family life. TR was the youngest ever president to assume office, and Biden is the oldest. Do you think these dynamics influence how the first ladies and their families are viewed by the public?
I do. I think that we are a youth-centric nation. And so I think there's more attraction to young families. But as the New York Times described our president as a super ager, it's even hard to believe the Bidens are quite as old as they are. There is a longevity of our in our country that didn't exist at the time of the Roosevelts. Poor Theodore died at 60. Well, our current president is way past 60, and so is his wife. And I think that we've grown more used to older people now being very, very vital. We don't think of them as old like we used to. But I do think there is tremendous fascination and excitement over a young couple. I think the Obamas had that. Their children were so young when they were elected, and there was so much excitement about where would they go to school? What would they do? And I think people were really interested in that. So I do think people love young people. The public loves a young family. It's so exciting. I mean, anyone who has a young family, even in a family when there's young people, it's such an energy. So it's hard to not be excited by a young family. But I do think that the grandchildren of the Bidens sort of fulfill that for them in some ways. I mean, to have a wedding at the White House, it's pretty exciting.
Thank you.
Great question, Kelly. Thank you for all your help with the archive.
It will seem like a shameless plug, as it is. But you've arrived at the Theodore Roosevelt Center to begin your research, and you've just started on Edith Roosevelt. What are you hoping to find?
Well, I think she was ahead of her time. And I think she was a woman who took that role with a lot of grace. And think about it. Think about having 5 children plus Alice, so 6 kids. And Alice was a little older, right? She got married, so even 5. And then Ethel had her debut. And yet every biography I read about Edith suggests that she was in control of it. I think it's the biography I was just reading calls her a sure-footed mistress of the mansion. And I think that that's apt, the sure-footed mistress of the mansion. So that's what I see now. I'm not expecting a surprise, except I'm thinking that I'll find more evidence that she inspired future first ladies to be sure-footed in the mansion. So, yeah, it was Gutgold, his book, Sure-Footed Mistress of the Mansion. Great line. Yeah. So I'm hoping to find more of that support to maybe make more claims that her tenure as First Lady inspired and laid the groundwork for women who we're more familiar with perhaps because they're more contemporary as first ladies. So, and maybe we'll get more young politicians wanting to be in the White House so that they can have a badger running around and a pony. So maybe that could happen. I think it would be great. So thank you so much for being such a wonderful, supportive audience with such really good questions. And I'm really having a wonderful time here at Dickinson State. So thank you for coming tonight.
Join me in thanking Dr. Nichola, Gutgold. And for those of you out there, thank you for watching. For those of you here, thank you for coming. If you know folks who are interested in being a visiting scholar at the Theodore Roosevelt Center right here at Dickinson State, we're happy to entertain that idea. We're certainly glad to be back and happy that we've launched this way. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. It's fun.